You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 29th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, is under investigation for the release of a Libyan wanted for war crimes, while Serbia's Prime Minister has resigned. We'll have the latest on both countries' political crises after that.
This comes at a time when the government's purse strings are at their tightest in decades, and Macron's influence on them is greatly diminished.
We check in on Emmanuel Macron's visit to the Louvre yesterday. We'll also speak with Monocle's design editor Nick Manise about the new commission for the Serpentine Pavilion here in London. And finally,
it's such an isolated place and, of course, uninhabited. But these things need to be settled.
We look at what Trump's latest Greenland claims have in common with the whiskey wars of yore between Denmark and Canada. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni may yet come to rue a decision by Italian authorities last week to release a Libyan chief of judicial police, Osama Najim, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court for alleged war crimes. Yesterday, Meloni announced that she is now being investigated by Italian authorities for aiding and abetting a crime and for embezzlement in connection with Najim's release. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Giorgia Scaturo. She's a London-based Italian reporter and producer. Giorgia, thanks very much for coming on the show for a quite complicated story. So let's perhaps start with what happened last week with the arrest and release of Najim.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Well, Najim, also known as Masri, is the general who is in charge of the Libyan prison police. And he was stopped in Turin while he was watching a football match. And this under a warrant of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that wanted him for suspected crimes against humanity, including torture, rape, and the killing of prisoners in Libya. Now, the Italian justice technicality are not the simplest to start with. And in this case, some diplomatic steps were deemed necessary. So the Rome Court of Appeal did not validate the ICC warrant, waiting for the Minister of Justice, Nordio, to send his formal approval of the request of arrest. But he never responded. And so Giorgia Meloni's government decided to put this individual on a state plane and repatriate him to Libya, where he was welcomed as an hero.
And what do we know? I mean, you say Giorgia Meloni's government there has kind of stepped in here with some of the delay. What do we know of Meloni's own involvement? Because I suppose that is what this comes down to a bit when it comes to these investigations.
Of course, Meloni is following the strategy of her friends Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And so last night, she's taken to social media to explain her brazen-faced and nails out in a video where she gave her own version of the facts, blaming the judicial technicality for the immediate repatriation of Masri, who she said was curiously only captured in Italy after merrily visiting 3 different countries, including London, Belgium, and Germany. Hence, she was sort of playing the victim of a political personal attack to her and her right-wing government. As a matter of fact, Italy has massive links to Libya when it comes to immigrations and energy. So a lot of Italian gas comes from Libya through a pipe that was inaugurated by Berlusconi and Gaddafi. So we go back quite some time with the economical and now immigration deals and agreements that we have with the country.
So, Giorgia, you laid out there Meloni's version and also some of these Libyan connections with Italy. But when it comes to the authorities and the prosecutors, can you perhaps tell us exactly what they are alleging, what the potential charges might be?
So the charges are officially two, so the ones that are at the moment investigated. And these are abetting General al-Masri, who, as we said, was wanted by the ICC for crime against humanity that are perpetrated since 2015, and also embezzlement for repatriating the Libyan suspect on a state plane, which was in use of the Italian secret services. So not an ordinary plane, which is the sort that is destined to any repatriation. It's a special case, so embezzlement is a potential charge there. And also the ICC has demanded an explanation, saying that they did not have been consulted over the decision to repatriate al-Masri.
And now, Giorgia, as you mentioned as well, with sort of Meloni defending herself and trying to come out in front of this yesterday, I do wonder what the reaction has been from Italian voters, from Italian media. I mean, is there a side, as it were, that people are coming down on when it comes to this, or is it just falling into a sort of polarized Italian space when it comes to someone like Meloni?
Well, I have to say, for Italians today, it feels a bit like a jump in the past. If we remember the Berlusconi era, where the former tycoon and prime minister was involved in several trials, and he was always blaming the so-called toghe rosse, the red judges. They were communist and vindictive judges whose aim was to destroy him and his right-wing party. So similarly, Meloni is attacking the judiciary, playing the part of a victim of a judicial system that, not by chance, in Italy is currently under review at the moment. So we've been there before, but now it will be a special tribunal of the Minister of Rome, whose judges are selected by ballot among civil and criminal judges of the Court of Appeal to conduct the investigation, and they will have 90 days to decide if they want to send the Italian Parliament a request to prosecute Meloni. But I have to say, given the Prime Minister's solid majority in Parliament, it is very unlikely that she will ever face the Italian court. So the battle is quintessentially political.
Well, and Giorgia, just finally, speaking of that being a political battle as well, I mean, do you get the sense that this will impact Giorgia Meloni's image at all and the strength of that majority? Because she has been, you know, in so many ways, quite a forceful prime minister until now.
Well, and she still is. This morning, she came back out saying she's firm, keeping her chin up, moving forward to defend Italian security. So she is counterattacking, playing the field of immigration, which is a very delicate nerve for Italians and for the rest of Europe, I have to say. In fact, there is a lot at stake because Meloni is considered somehow the Queen of Europe. She's been hailed as the leader with a plan when it comes to immigration. So she's inspired other European leaders, including our Prime Minister Keir Starmer, because arrivals in Italy last year fell by 60%. And this is mainly due to the efforts of Tunisian and Libyan security forces to intercept migrant boats setting up for Europe. So, and this is the result of an agreement that Meloni has with Libya since 2017. So yes, there is a lot at stake. She's playing the card of what Italians and Europeans fear the most, so the flood of immigrants. On the other hand, we all know the economic interest that I was mentioning before. So there is a very good chance that Meloni pulls out this crisis again.
The Italian journalist Giorgia Scaturo, thank you very much for joining us. And now here is Hassan Anderson with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The military governments of Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso have all withdrawn from the Economic Community of West African States, also known as ECOWAS. The countries first announced their intention to leave in January last year, demanding the restoration of democratic rule in Niger following a military coup. Russia's military says that its air defense systems downed 100 Ukrainian drones in an overnight attack. Most of the drones were downed over the western border regions of Kursk and Bryansk. Ukraine's military said Russia launched an overnight drone attack of its own, resulting in air alerts in multiple Ukrainian regions. And a passenger aircraft has caught fire in Busan in South Korea, with 3 people sustaining minor injuries while evacuating. Fire authorities said an Air Busan plane bound for Hong Kong caught fire at its tail before takeoff. All 169 passengers and 7 crew members aboard evacuated on an inflatable slide. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Hassan. To Serbia now, which is in the midst of its own political crisis after a wave of student-led protests over a November rail disaster reached a fever pitch in the last few days, with a violent attack against students on Monday, prompting the country's prime minister to resign yesterday. Now Serbia's president, Aleksandar Vučić, is looking to take the temperature down further by pardoning some of the protesters who were facing charges. Well, it's time to talk about this with Monocle's correspondent for the Balkan region, Guy Delany. Good morning, Guy.
Morning, Chris, and morning all.
Take us back to yesterday, first of all. How did Prime Minister Milos Vučević's resignation unfold?
Well, he resigned in the morning, and this was after a 24-hour protest which was held in Belgrade at one of the major road junctions. But it wasn't that protest which he said triggered his resignation. Rather, it was an attack in the early hours of Tuesday morning in Serbia's second city, Novi Sad, when students who were placing stickers outside the offices of the governing Progressive Party were attacked by people who came out from inside the office. And these were clearly people who were connected somehow to the Progressive Party. Now, Mr. Vučić said that wasn't acceptable. You couldn't have that sort of thing going on, that there needed to be less tension, and he wanted to calm the passions that had been persisting in the country. Therefore, he was tendering his resignation.
Now, President Vučić is, as a result of this, also, well, there's 2 things. He is pardoning some of the protesters, and police, I understand, are arresting those responsible for Monday's attacks. Do you get the sense that that will be enough to calm things down again?
Well, it's certainly going to give people pause for thought. Now, in terms of the pardons, what's happening there is that 13 people who were charged following a protest in Novi Sad on the 5th of November are going to be offered pardons by President Vučić. Now, this is an unprecedented step for Mr. Vučić. He's never offered anybody pardons before, even though he's been in office since 2017. But he says, again, it's something he feels he has to do in order to reduce the tensions in the country. In terms of how the pardons are going down, some of the people who he's presenting them to have said they don't want them, that they haven't done anything wrong, criminally speaking, so why do they need a pardon?
So this is an interesting, part of the reason for this is that these protests have been going on for so long, essentially since November. This is what's prompting this sort of climb down by Vučić. Do you get the sense that the students are going to stop as a result of this and whatever happens next politically, or are the protests going to continue?
Well, they didn't stop yesterday. They went out on the streets again yesterday in support of the students who'd been attacked in Novi Sad. So it's if you like, almost a game of protester whack-a-mole at the moment, because Mr. Vučić may have resigned as prime minister because of the incident in Novi Sad, but then the students have come out in the streets because of it. And they're saying, have our demands really been met? As Mr. Vučić is suggesting, Mr. Vučić is saying, look, we've prosecuted the people who were responsible for attacking students. We have offered pardons to people who were charged. We've released a lot of the paperwork relating to the disaster at Novi Sad railway station in November, which is what sparked all of this series of protests in the first place. In essence, he's asking them, what more do you want? But, the students saying that they don't believe that everything has been transparent in terms of the release of documents. They don't think, as I've said, that these pardons are really the correct way to be going about things. The criminal charges should never have been brought in the first place. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next few days whether there's a degree of stalemate, if you like, or continuing protest, because the students at the moment haven't really been indicating that they're convinced by what Mr. Vučić and indeed Mr. Vučević have done.
And Guy, what happens politically now because of the resignation of the prime minister? Will President Vučić appoint a new prime minister, or are new elections likely?
Well, this is what we're waiting to see. He says he's going to decide within the next 10 days what he's going to do. Now, what the sequence of events, it's going to be that the National Assembly, first of all, has to accept the resignation of the Prime Minister. That then, in essence, starts a clock running, a 30-day clock, And within those 30 days, Mr. Vučić, the president, has to appoint a new prime minister. If he doesn't, then there will automatically be parliamentary elections. And the previous parliamentary elections in Serbia were only just over a year ago, and the governing Progressive Party, of which Mr. Vučić is the co-founder, completely dominated those elections. So he may be feeling confident about going to another election and saying, look, this is going to resolve the issue. Alternatively, he could put in another safe pair of hands, which Mr. Vučević was seen to be, an ally of Mr. Vučić, somebody who would, in essence, do what he was told. Or it's been suggested to me that he might try and find somebody who's slightly above the political fray, somebody who's not a member of a political party, but who could be respected by all parties as somebody who could be the head of government in Serbia. At the moment, Mr. Vučić said he's open to consultations from all parties, even though he says he believes he'll just get a lot of insults from some people, which is actually probably true.
Well, just finally, Guy, then on that point, what has the role of the opposition been in all of this? What is their view of it? What do they hope to gain, I suppose, also politically? Do they expect to gain from all of this?
The funny thing is the opposition have been rather sidelined because the students haven't wanted anything to do with them. They've wanted to present themselves as being politically non-attached, if you like. And then the other complicating factor is that the opposition in Serbia is extremely fractured. There isn't one single large opposition party that people could rally around. And when you've got all these sort of little fractured parties, a lot of which struggle to get past the 5% threshold to make it into parliament in the first place, and they've all got their leaders and they've all got their egos, you can imagine it's very hard to present a compelling proposition to the voters. And, you know, that's part of the success of Mr. Vučić and the Progressive Party over the years. The opposition in this case is saying that they don't think there should be elections unless there's a transitional government first, which could establish the conditions for a fair vote. Mr. Vučić has said, not on your Nelly. That's not going to happen. So I think that's one thing at least we can rule out as a transitional government.
Not on your Nelly. Guy Deloney, Monocle's Balkans correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing, and I'm Chris Chermak. The Louvre is one of Paris's most iconic locations, and yesterday France's President Emmanuel Macron was on hand to announce a complete overhaul of the museum. Simon Bouvier, Monocle's Paris bureau chief, reports.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente, pour vos mots. Mesdames, Messieurs les ministres, Mesdames, Messieurs les ambassadeurs, Monsieur le Président du Conseil constitutionnel, Mesdames, Messieurs les parlementaires.
Standing in front of the Mona Lisa yesterday, French President Emmanuel Macron announced a grand plan for, quote, a rethought, restored, and expanded Louvre that will fully become the epicenter of art history for our country and beyond. His announcement follows the publication of a memo about the museum's state of disrepair, which alarmed the entire nation. No figure has been made public, but the Élysée reportedly puts the price tag for the project, which includes the reconstruction of a new entrance to the museum and moving the Mona Lisa to a standalone facility, at around 800 million euros over 10 years. That's more than the reconstruction of Notre Dame. This comes at a time when the government's purse strings are at their tightest in decades, and Macron's influence on them is greatly diminished. There are rumors the project will lean heavily on private contributions from the likes of LVMH boss Bernard Arnault. It's easy to be skeptical of a spotlight-hungry president.
Alors que le monde semble partir dans tous les sens, c'est que manifestement les discussions budgétaires se poursuivent.
The museum's state of disrepair mirrors the wilting of his own standing after a disastrous decision to call early elections sidelined him from domestic policymaking. But when Notre Dame burned, Macron's ambition to rebuild the cathedral in 5 years was roundly mocked as wishful thinking. It turned out to be a rare self-esteem boost for a nation that is habitually pessimistic about its own prospects. If Macron is indeed marshalling a new élan of generosity from private citizens, wealthy and otherwise, to make the Louvre's restoration another example of France coming together in a divisive political moment, it would be foolish to doubt him again, weakened and unpopular as the president is.
That was Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief, Simon Bouvier. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. The Serpentine Pavilion here in London is an annual tradition that sparks an enormous amount of interest, starting with which architect gets the commission to build it. And joining me now in the studio to unveil the pavilion's latest creator is our design editor, Nick Manise. Nick, you've been to Paris and back. It's good to actually see you in London for a change.
Physically, for 2 weeks. I'm here 2 weeks only, so make the most of it, Christopher.
2 weeks only, we will make the most of it.
Yeah, soak up these, luscious locks and colourful shirts, even though I'm in a white shirt today. This is not what we're here to talk about.
This is not what we're here to talk about. Can we
get down to business? Can you stop distracting me, please?
I will try.
Okay,
I will try to stop because we do have this pavilion. And before we actually get to the commission, I did want to ask you why the pavilion matters. Tell us about it.
That is a superb question. It's one I ask myself every year. It's super important. It's almost, I guess you could see it as an architectural testing ground. This is where people come to explore ideas about architecture in a very high-profile way. Lots of cities across the world, lots of often art galleries or design museums have annual commissions where they might, commission an architect to design a pavilion that's temporary, that's perhaps doing a similar sort of thing where they're trying to push an idea forward. So it's an architectural testing ground, which is a common thing. But what makes this significant is that it is in London, in Hyde Park.
It's just the prominence of it.
The prominence of it. It's such a high-profile place to be building and testing an idea, and that's what makes it significant. I mean, previous people that have been commissioned. This is the 25th anniversary this year, but you've got Zaha Hadid, Oscar Niemeyer, Rem Koolhaas, all these kind of famous names. Some of them were less famous when they took it on. Some of them were more famous when they took it on. So to be included in that canon of architects is also significant for the person that wins the commission.
So it's also interesting that it's, I guess, sometimes very established architects, sometimes somewhat up-and-coming architects. So with that in mind, tell us who got the commission this year.
So Marina Tabassum, who's a Bangladeshi architect, she's kind of straddling that middle ground. I wouldn't necessarily say she's a star
on
architect,
the rise.
but yeah, she's well known, and her work's super impressive and super important. And I mean, it's pretty clear why she's been chosen. She's somebody that's operating at the intersection of architecture and culture and research. She's maybe best known for her Kudibari houses, which she developed for people living on sand beds of Indian rivers. These are modular structures that can be taken apart and put together and relocated. So it's giving almost a permanent architecture for people that might be a little bit more nomadic or, have to shift around based on the landscapes that they're living in. So I think that's maybe why she's been chosen. She's this person that's, I guess, tapping into cultural heritages and bringing that into architecture.
And tell us how you then expect she might use this opportunity. What kind of things will she build in Hyde Park?
So we've seen the renders and the drawings that were released yesterday. Unless you're like me and you get a little bit of a scoop beforehand, the perks of being the design editor.
See, we should have had you on already like 2 days ago.
No, I was under strict embargo,
everything.
Christopher. I can't do anything like that.
Oh, the journalistic embargo.
Yeah, the journalistic embargo. But she's developed this to try and paint a picture. It almost looks like a pill that like a supplement pill that you might take with your zinc and your vitamin A and B, like that sort of a capsule-y kind of thing that looks like it's been chopped in half. So only the top, only one half of it is visible from above the surface, and then it's kind of got these faceted openings along the length of it. I don't know if that's done it justice, but that's kind of what we're working with. But what it is doing is it's drawing on the history and the architectural language of the Shamayana tents or awnings that are found throughout South Asia. So these are kind of gathering spaces that have these curved awnings over them, and people can move and gather inside them. And that's what she wants with the Serpentine Pavilion this year, is this idea that people will be able to come and connect and gather in this space. And I believe, if my interpretation's correct, you're going to be able to, I guess, slide facets of this hemispherical pill along its length to create different gathering moments in it. But again, this is coming back to her ability to draw on cultural heritage and cultural narratives and bring that into architecture. And I think that's, to answer your question, why she's been commissioned.
Well, why she's been commissioned. Just finally then, when it comes to something like the Serpentine Pavilion, the way you mentioned it, I guess I'm just curious. It's not necessarily that she, in this case, or that the pavilion is something that's built that then can be moved to somewhere else. She has clearly done projects that you describe that are really interesting. But in this case, it's as much about the symbolism in a community space rather than a sort of practical pavilion.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's and it was a kind of similar thing last year with Min Suk Cho, who is this Korean architect that developed this form inspired by traditional Korean houses, hanoks built around a courtyard. So you can already see maybe from the Serpentine Pavilion commissioning team, there's a little bit of an interest in, maybe there's a cultural narrative here. But what I love about this, and what I loved about Min Suk Cho's last year as well, is that, it's not saying, hey, British architects or architects in Australia who are looking at this project, build something that's inspired by the Shamayana tents or by the hanok. It's saying, maybe look around you for inspiration. Look at the architectural and cultural narratives that are in the place where you're working, and maybe consider finding a way to bring that into your work.
Nick Manise, Monocle's design editor, thank you very much for joining us. This is The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, Denmark has said it would spend 14.6 billion kroner on boosting security in the Arctic and North Atlantic, 1 month after announcing what its defense minister called a double-digit billion defense package. Yesterday, the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen embarked on a whirlwind tour of Berlin, Paris, and Brussels to shore up support amid Donald Trump's claims on Greenland. All of this might seem very different to a situation a few years ago when Denmark and Canada resolved a peaceful dispute over an uninhabited rock that sits about halfway between Greenland and Nunavut. Xander Brett looks back at the Whiskey War, whose resolution appeared to set an example for the world.
It's a war you've probably never heard of, one of whiskey, fought, if you could call it fought, between two NATO allies, Denmark and Canada. The pretext: who ruled Hans Island, a 1.3 kilometres squared rock in the Kennedy Channel between Greenland, part of the Danish realm, and the Canadian territory of Nunavut. A maritime boundary had been discussed in the 1970s, but left out the question of Hans Island, uninhabited, but part of local fishing and hunting grounds for centuries. Apostolos Siovelis is a research associate at the Arctic Institute Centre for Circumpolar Security Studies.
So the island, Tartupaluk as they call it in their local language, has historically been used from the Inuit people, traversing the sea ice continuum between Greenland and Ellesmere Island. The beginning of the dispute is rooted in the 1933 International Court of Justice decision that acknowledged Danish sovereignty over the entirety of Greenland. That set the scene for the 1973 delimitation agreement, where both parties realized that Hans Island lies in the middle.
Tom Høyen was the Danish Minister for Greenland for much of the 1980s.
I got a letter from a Canadian man called Ken Harper, and he told me that he had met people who had a cap where they had written Hans Island. And Dome Patrol had sent people without asking us in Denmark to Hans Island. And of course, we were agreeing to not escalate the situation. On the other hand, we had in some way to protest. I participated in a geological camp in Greenland. My idea was from there to go to Hans Island. And we had also decided that we would plant a flag there, but we had no flagpole. So we took one of the masts from the tent. And then I wrote in a normal business card, if anyone passes here, no one passes here, then you are welcome to take a drink of this cognac called Napoleon. Also the Canadians, then they're welcome to have a drink. They reacted sending a warship on the island. They placed a bottle of their Canadian whiskey, but it became humoristic.
The placing and replacing of bottles would go on for years. Peak in fighting, though, came perhaps in 2005, when Bill Graham, the Canadian Defence Minister, set foot on the island. A letter of protest was swiftly issued by Denmark. 2005, though, the year of Graham's visit, would mark the beginning of the end of the Whiskey War. Canada and Denmark, supported by the government in Greenland, agreed to enter into discussions. In 2022, a plan to split the island, roughly 40-60, was unveiled. John Geiger is CEO of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society.
It's such an isolated place and, of course, uninhabited. But these things need to be settled. And the Hans Island Treaty was signed at the headquarters of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, which I remember talking to the Danish ambassador about it before the Hans Island Treaty was signed. And just because the nature of our friendly relations with the Danish crown is, I don't think it was ever anticipated being anything but something that would be resolved diplomatically. And there are provisions that allow the transit of the Inuit back and forth, so the traditional cultural behaviors are not interrupted. So it was wonderful that the Prime Minister of Greenland was present for the treaty signing. He was one of the signatories. The Premier of Nunavut was also present, and their interests were, I think, protected.
So now there's a border on Hans Island, though no border control. The Whiskey War's conclusion, however, has resulted in a byproduct. Canada and the Danish realm no longer have just one land border each, with the United States and Germany respectively. Now, indeed, they have a land border with each other, albeit one that's just over a kilometre long. Apostolos Tsiavalas again.
From the Canadian side, it's almost impossible to get on the limestone, while the Greenlandic side is a bit more smooth, and the border has been delineated on the basis of ridge cutting across the island. As far as of my knowledge, there is no organized tourism expeditions going on the island as such.
This agreement was a significant historic milestone in the relationship between friends and neighbours, said Charlotte McLeod, as spokesperson for Global Affairs Canada. The efforts deployed to reach this outcome demonstrate their commitment to resolve disputes peacefully and in accordance with international law. President Trump recently turned the world's attention to this region. He restated a desire to require Greenland. "I think we're going to have it," he asserted on Air Force One, having reportedly been in a heated phone call with Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen. How seriously we should take Trump's claim is a matter of discussion, but the rhetoric certainly seems to have been less well received in many countries. A good-humoured case of the Danish-Canadian Whiskey War.
Xander Brett, thank you very much for that. For more on why Greenland matters, you can also listen to the Foreign Desk Explainer with Andrew Muller, be premiering later this evening. That's all the time we have, though, for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.